the policy making, why we had to get there to do that, and what has been the impact of that policy. So it's more like a story on where we came from and why, how we got here.
Sure. It is a fairly long story, Kishore,
Yeah,
if we
I'll
have.
a brief introduction.
Sure, sure. Uh, yeah, let me, so, so essentially, see, I think there are three distinct phases to the way the regulators have, or the policy for drones have evolved, essentially. There was a time pre 2014 when there was really no explicit regulation for the drone industry, right? So you have the DGCA, which is primarily tasked with the job of regulating manned aviation, and all regulations, the various cars that exist today, except for the one that now governs drones, everything else was largely targeted at regulating the manned aviation industry. So if you were to ask me pre 2014 as a lawyer, if you were to come to me and say, hey, can I undertake this kind of drone operation, we would actually look at the various regulations or guidelines available for manned aviation and try to apply those to the drone industry as well. And that is and I think in 2014, what began to happen was there were I think that was the year when a lot of new activity or drone activity generally started to make a fair bit of buzz in the media as well. So if you recall, Amazon actually announced that they were going to start home delivery by Diwali, or there was this news by a pizzeria in Bombay trying to wanting to deliver pizzas, etc. And I think all of this suddenly shook up the DGCA into action. And this is something that I've seen not only in drones, but in blockchain and cryptocurrency, where we work quite extensively, and many other novel tech industries, that when the regulator does not exactly know how to regulate because it's so new, right? It essentially adopts one of two regulatory approaches. One is that either you just stay quiet and let the industry evolve, and you wait and watch and see how other countries are evolving their regulation and apply it. Or the other is you go ahead and ban it, pull the entire industry down, and so that at least you are covered, right? I mean, if anything were to go wrong tomorrow, it's not on you. And then again, wait and watch, right? See how other countries are evolving their jurisprudence on this. And the DGCA, much like we see many other regulators, I think the DGCA also chose the latter, which is to put out the circular in October 14, which essentially said, well, it actually did not ban drone activity. It asked for an approval, but it made the process so hard that it was a de facto ban. Right. So, in fact, it's very so that's one phase. From absolutely no regulation to 2014 when you had this circular, and I can of course talk at length about. So I have some very interesting tidbits about the fallout of the circular, etc. But that was phase number 2, and then phase number 3 was I think for the longest time the circular remained in place, and there was absolutely, I mean, while drone activity continued, there was very little regulatory there were no approvals really that were granted as per the circular. And then it kind of came to a point where, while there was generally pressure on the DGCA and the MOCA to put in place some regulations from various arms of the government, but there was really very little consensus between the different governmental agencies on what that regulation should look like, because of which there was no movement for the longest time. In fact, CAR 1.0 came in after many iterations. It took many years. And ultimately, what happened was that this regulatory tussle between the different agencies of the government became so kind of amplified that I think it led to the third phase, where you saw the DGCA and MOCA really put their weight behind the sector, and kind of do some very quick policy making, and ultimately that led to the CAR 1.0 and Digital Sky. And I would say that it was an interesting idea for its time, but clearly it has not played out very well, right? It has ultimately grounded the industry, no pun intended, and so we are where we are right now. But I think it's interesting. It would be interesting to kind of study each of these phases, and see why one led to the other and brought us to the place we are in. But yeah, that's how I see it.
So I think that's quite interesting in understanding this, because one among the things that happens in the drone industry, at least in India, is that a lot of the initial drone people came into the industry basically from a background of aero modeling. Subsequently, it is basically it's a lot of information. I mean, a lot of projects that have been open source projects which have probably made them enthusiastic and then get into the drone activity. But initially, the first drone people were all people from the aero modeling industry. Was there any regulation to begin with for the aero modeling community in the earlier days? Aero modeling was always a niche of the NCC, and they probably had the regulation. But out of the NCC, then what was the regulation, and uh, was it chaos back then as well?
Sure. So I haven't studied the aero modeling kind of industry so much, really. But my understanding is that there is a very slim set of guidelines for the aero modeling industry, but it largely was in a state of self-regulation of sorts, because you have these clubs which would ensure that things are done the right way. But I'm really no authority to speak about the aero modeling industry as it existed before the drone industry.
So, my own understanding, since I was an aero modeler before coming into the area of drones, so in the initial days, it was very much self-regulatory, as you said. We had absolutely no control from an authority on us to say that this is what you can do and this is what you cannot do. So it was all among us, between us, that we would think what is safe and what is not safe. There was no regulation, to the best of my understanding. These were younger days when probably we would not have understood the impacts of going against the law, so we never even cared for it. In a way, that's how we did aero modeling. So, and as we did it, we flew in places where we probably were not authorized, because it was a dried out lake. So these are the kind of activities that we did as aero modeling. However, safety was only ensured by as a community. We people watch over each other, and that's how we ensured safety in many ways, and scold someone who does something which is funny or not supposed to be done. These are the kind of ways we actually did it. So we were not aware of any kind of a law or a mandate on which we where to fly, how to fly, no rules of any of these kinds. I also tend to think that because of the lack of such kind of a regulation at that stage, in those early stage, the same thing started trickling down into the drone activity, and that's where the problem starts. So this here's another part that I want to this thing. So when we did aero modeling, it was more for fun. Drone became a business. So the regulation came to control a business rather than the entertainment, the fun activity of it. Can you talk about what is the impact of all of these regulation that has had on the the entertainment and the fun aspect of aero modeling? And I'll also say, more than fun, I mean, I'll follow it up with saying that the innovation that came into the drone also came in from the aero modeling guys. So I'd like to extend it to that as well subsequently.
No, absolutely. I think, and in fact, you mentioned about going to these dried up lakes to fly or model planes. It is unfortunate that even today, I know of manufacturers, drone manufacturers, who have no choice but to test out their drones that they're building, prototyping at these dried up lakes where there's very little chance of a police personnel to catch hold of you. So things have unfortunately not changed too much. See, you're absolutely right. So while aero modeling was always was entertainment first, but I think even our regulations of the law recognize that how that the impact of aero modeling, or the positive impact of aero modeling in innovation for the aviation industry. So you actually had this car which was later on suspended, which actually provided for experimental aviation, and it allowed small scale activity for experimental flying, and it essentially recognized. In fact, if I'm not wrong, the very preamble of that car actually recognized that aero modeling is a has the spillover benefit. So I certainly agree with you, and likewise. And for that reason, even I remember that when we were engaging with the regulators, the DGCA in particular, for drone regulations, we always we separately make representations for the aero modeling community as well. That just like the spillover benefits of aero modeling in manned aviation, there is also I think even in the drone industry or the drone regulations should recognize that and provide for a lower level of regulation or regulatory supervision on the aero modeling community. So I fully agree with you on that. Now, having said that, unfortunately, the entertainment value of drones, I think, has also led to some of the prejudices that crept into the regulatory system against drones. So for a very long time, actually, the regulators did not take the drone industry very seriously for the reason that I think this is, and I base this on a number of conversations I've had with the regulators, that what is this? I mean, ultimately these are toys. Our primary responsibility is manned aviation, where the lives of hundreds of people are at stake every single time an airplane takes off. So why are you wasting our time over something which is largely just a teenager's kind of a toy for a teenager. I think that prejudice also did a fair bit of harm. But so that's my take on it. It took a fair while for everybody to realize that there is a lot more that can be done with drones, and in fact, the future of the industry hinges on efficient and effective use of drones. I mean, going forward 5 years, 10 years, I think the efficiency of Indian industry, you can't. I mean, you cannot compete with the world, with the global industry, if you do not have an effective drone industry supporting it.
But how would you say that you can differentiate between the entertainment or the hobbies kind of activity from the commercial or the activity that needs regulations? How do you think the separation is done, and how do you think it can be affected on the ground?
So I don't actually want to make that distinction. All I'm saying is that the regulator had make that artificial distinction and had some inherent bias. But the way that distinction is kind of is carried through is one in terms of size and weight, right? The weight categorization of drones. So necessarily when you have very limited regulation around the use of nano drones, and a big use case of nano drones is actually entertainment. So that indirectly kind of, even though the guidelines do not specifically allow or disallow any kind of entertainment related use, but the weight categorization, of course, allows you to carry on some basic entertainment kind of use cases without much restriction. So I think that's how it gets taken care of.
Okay. So there's another part of the question that came in. Why? See, the ban, the effective ban came in October 7th of 2014. And it took some time till 18 December to actually get the first regulation out. What prompted them to introduce the ban so early on and then have the regulation start working on? Was there any particular case or certain reason for them to actually enforce this ban suddenly on the October 7th of 2014?
Yeah, as I said earlier, so there was a fair bit of news. The media was abuzz with some of these announcements by various companies and other, where everybody was getting quite excited about the use of drones for all kinds of things. And I'm pretty sure that there must have been. I mean, all of that woke up the DGCA to act. But as I mentioned earlier, the reason for the ban to me simply is a very it's a very convenient regulatory approach. That if I don't know how to regulate, I'm safer banning you. If I don't
Right.
know exactly because if I do choose to issue guidelines as they have done today, and somebody flies in a compliant manner but yet crashes, killing somebody, right? Then it is on the questions will also be raised. Fingers will be pointed at the regulator as well, right? So I think it's a very convenient regulatory approach to ban something that you are not completely sure of, and then wait and watch as to how the US is regulating, how the EU is regulating, and adopt those policies over a period of time. Now, the DGCA also is, it's my belief that they thought that, and listen, this is true for even the manned aviation industry in India. Almost every bit of our, regulations that govern manned aviation have been borrowed from other jurisdictions.
Right.
Uh, it is just not in our DNA to kind of evolve new guidelines, and I'm not necessarily using that to make a point. I mean, I'm just saying that's historically that's been the case, and the DGCA would have expected that it will play out in the very same manner for the drones industry as well. Allow these other countries to regulate, to experiment with regulations, and we will adopt. However, things didn't quite play out like that. And when finally, because the US also came up with, for example, US and EU came up with these experimental licenses and limited scope licenses, etc., but not really a full-fledged regulatory guidance. And so we didn't really find anything. I mean, the DGCA continued to play it very safe, basically. Now, what happened, I think, over a period of time is that there was obviously the demand from the drone industry and from the regular industry for allowing drone operations. And the pressure was building up on the DGCA to a point when they started. Then they first mooted the idea that we will now, why don't we come up with some kind of regulations, and we involve different governmental agencies to weigh in on this. Now, drones necessarily are a subject area which are not the sole, which do involve multiple governmental agencies, right? So whether it is the defense, the air force, the airports authority, the MHA, the wireless planning commission from a telecom and spectrum perspective. So there are just so many different agencies that are at play, right? And when the DGCA was finally able to involve all of these people and bring them in the same room to kind of brainstorm on what this policy should look like, they were not able to achieve consensus for the longest time. In fact, it went from bad to worse over a period of time where, primarily, I mean, it was, so while the DGCA was concerned from a safety perspective, the MHA was concerned from a security perspective. The defense also had similar issues. And these were all opposing interests. It went, and nobody could agree to a minimum baseline standard that could satisfy everybody. In fact, it went to an extent where at some point the MHA actually introduced a draft bill to govern drone operations, which was their own bill, which is shocking because really, if you think about it, the MHA is not the appropriate regulator for drone activity. It's got to be the DGCA. And this MHA bill, proposed bill, did not even name the DGCA. So that was the extent to which the regulators were opposed and had a difference in opinion. I think this was, it kind of became very, very complex. It was a very complex issue to navigate through.
So that's something that you brought up, which is quite interesting to actually know, because it was an open knowledge information that there was this conflict between DGCA and MHA in terms of MHA thrusting the responsibility on DGCA when they didn't want to take the responsibility. It's something like that. And but I wasn't at all aware of this bill that was put up in the context over here. And last thing with regard to the history, I mean, this is my own perception, but 2014 and just the preceding year to that was, in my opinion, the rise of the open source software of drones. And all of those contributed to actually making it easily accessible, and a lot of hobbies actually getting into drones. And probably causing harm or potentially could cause harm. So that was when this rise and the ban on drones actually came up. Do you have anything to say about that?
No, so I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow the question. If you could just.
So what I'm trying to say is 2014 and the year before that is probably when the maximum work on open source drones and the software, because the earlier aero modeling was about craft work. It really had to do it had to deal with the skills of the person. So you didn't have the number of people participating in the hobby as much as when the drones started to be a transfer, when multi-rotors became the norm, and the skill transferred from everything in mechanical hobby, craft work, to electronics and software development, all of these being available components for people to just simply download. It didn't really require them to build on any skills. You just pick out components from the local shop, and then you just make a software and then you fly it. The skill was not developed, but you already had the tools. You already were a player in the market.
You're asking if that had anything to do with the ban, leading
Yes,
up to the
yes.
ban. I That's an interesting thought. I don't think so. I mean, or maybe actually indirectly so, because as I said, there was an increase in activity. See, thankfully, India hasn't really seen any kind of, or in fact, globally, the industry hasn't seen any kind of accidents, so to say, right? Which, if because if you have one major incident where say there's a crash, or say some kind of a incident with a manned aircraft or something, I think that will just completely change the way regulators think about the regulation. It will give the regulations a very different shape, right? So thankfully, we've not had that, and we definitely didn't have that up until 2014. I mean, my uh, thinking is that it was largely the kind of the announcements that were made in that year about all this new drone activity. And maybe the reason for that is actually what you're saying, which is that, because now there was a sudden spurt, and just about anybody who had a certain bent of mind could go and create their own drones, and then start doing these kind of experiments. Got the DGCA kind of worked up about this. That's possible, but I'm not too sure about that.
Oh, okay. So, okay, that's for the past of how we got here, and what is now the current regulation? How is it actually playing out? How is it? How effective has it been? What is your comments on that?
No, so the regulations haven't been effective at all, because they've obviously not they failed to achieve what they set out to achieve, which is a promising drone industry for the country, right? So in fact, it is interesting that the drone activity in the country has actually fallen down, has reduced after the policy came into play. Right? Because prior to the announcement for Digital Sky, at least, there was a fair bit of ambiguity, owing to which, on account of which, people were able to carry out certain operations. Now, if you go to the DGCA for a license, the simple answer is, apply for a license pursuant to the policy, and you really can't, because that policy requires a functional Digital Sky for you to get a license. So so obviously that's not happening. So the policy has done us more harm than good. And I think, while the Digital Sky as an idea was unprecedented for its times, it's a beautiful idea, right? You are basically giving a license not to a human being, but directly to the machine itself, to make sure that if it is unlicensed, it doesn't fly, and you have complete control over the operation. And that's phenomenal for any regulator.
Hmm.
Now, while the idea itself was great, it was a little too ahead of its times, and overly ambitious, because in the time to come, they have not been able to build out the technological backbone that is necessary to deploy this, and that has resulted in the kind of the situation that we are in right now. So the policy hasn't worked. And what is unfortunate is that we've also not acted fast enough or done anything at all to really circumvent the failings of that policy, right? So I think it's been enough time for us to realize what's not working and then figure out other ways to solve for it. But we are still trying to fix the, kind of, instead of undoing what we put in place and coming up with a new structure, we're still trying to gradually fixing the digital sky system, which is going to take its own time. I think we're still very far away from implementing a workable digital sky model, and so yeah, it's bad news.
In 2018 December is when the car came out, and 2019 January is when there was an announcement again for car 2.0 draft, and that which introduces BVLOS, beyond visual line of sight operations, which basically is the basis for enabling delivery systems. So and I think there was an expression of interest that came out sometime few months after January, maybe March, April, sometime last year. And so so what is the current status with regard to delivery, its legality, and where are we? What is the current position with DGCA?
So as of today, BVLOS operations are not permitted under the car as it exists. The only operations, the tests that are being done by a certain set of selected certain companies that have been selected to carry out these operations, and these licenses are directly being given by the DGCA. So it's still very experimental, and we are far off from having some kind of solid regulatory framework that enables BVLOS operations. But let's be real, we are far off even from having regular course operations pursuant to the policy. So, I'm very circumspect of any kind of bold announcements that are made these days by the DGCA, because if you're saying that, well, because there's really no point in having these kind of, in kind of expending energy on experiments for which are 5 years, which may see the day of the light, or sorry, light of the day 5 years hence. But when we're not even working on solving the basic core problems for the industry. In fact, I would say that BVLOS operations could have been permitted even at Car 1. There were enough conversations around the feasibility of BVLOS operations, and I think very limited scope BVLOS operations. Not that you allow anybody and everybody to start doing beyond visual line of sight, but for certain categories of operators, for certain kinds of end use cases, we could have permitted BVLOS even then. And it was necessary to do so, because I think any drone policy that does not enable BVLOS operations is short-sighted. You really can't have meaningful drone operations without, because if I have to operate only within visual line of sight, maybe I don't even need drones. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, they add incremental efficiency, but the true potential of drones can only be met if you allow beyond visual line of sight. So that's one thing. I can though tell you that at the point in time when Car 1 was issued, the industry was happy with whatever little was given to them. And the regulators were also convinced, because it was, for everybody, including the regulators, it was so frustrating. It was a frustrating 2 years to finally make progress to a point where you see a document, the final car. At that point, everybody had given up and they were just happy with whatever was. And the consensus was that let's just release something, start some basic activity, and then over a period of time we'll keep iterating on the policy. But that has definitely not happened, because we couldn't even have your basic set of operations permitted on the basis of Car 1.
I think, yeah, that's quite a, I don't know, it's quite a difficult proposition, because I think once a policy has come out, it's going to be, for various reasons, very difficult to roll back on any part of it, So It's sometimes better to be conservative to begin with than to put an ambitious one and roll back, which wouldn't happen. So I don't know how that's going to actually play out. Uh, there's of course then comes the other part. I think Zomato is one among the people who's begun. There were reports on their doing the deliveries based on using drones. So what is the kind of activity that's been happening with regard to delivery and the testing currently?
Yeah, so see, I mean, I can't talk as to the specifics of what individual players are or what stage they are at right now, but I can say that delivery is certainly shaping up in an interesting way. Firstly, at the point at the time when Car One was issued, I think the DGCA or the other regulators could not even fathom the possibility of delivery. So delivery was specifically carved out of the car and not allowed at that point. And nobody was even serious about. I mean, the regulators were not even seriously considering the possibility. But now that we actually have licenses being given for testing, etc., I think the regulatory mindset has evolved to the extent where they're open to the possibility, where they are happy for the industry to try this out as well. I think in parallel the industry has also evolved a fair bit. The technology has evolved. In fact, a couple of things are happening now. One is that the tech itself. So there are a number of patents that have been filed for drones and use of drones for delivery. In fact, Amazon has some very interesting patents of late, which allow gesture controlled drone operations where the recipient can actually give instructions and stuff like that. That's one interesting thing. The other is also there are various business models which are being tried out to enable delivery. So, for instance, we are not saying that you deliver directly to the end consumer at their house, because that obviously creates a lot of challenges. But can we have mobile ports that can move around the city, or maybe hubs within the city where you can have a drone deliver, and then you build a a delivery model from that hub to the
Hmm.
end consumer. So a bunch of different things are being tried out, and the regulator seems to be playing ball to a certain extent, which is great.
Okay, and that's quite interesting actually what they're doing. Lastly, with regard to delivery, as we understand it, delivery, as you said, is not legal in Car 1.0. It's not part of the scope of Car 1.0. Then came the whole thing about farm spraying of pesticide and other things in for agricultural applications, and by the wording of the car, it becomes a part under the delivery which is prohibited, because nothing should separate from the aircraft is the definition of what delivery is all about.
Correct,
So
correct.
and so it becomes an illegal activity to actually do spraying. However, there is an I think there's an associated document, not part of the policy document, which allows you to do spraying only for a farmer.
Hmm.
So but yet we are now seeing all of these during the COVID, we are having spraying in the city being done and all that, using drones, the spray of in the disinfectant using drones. So it's strictly speaking not legal, but what are your comments on how is DGCA trying to address these kind of
No, I
use
think
cases?
even the DGCA FAQs um, actually speak about use of RPAs for UAVs for agricultural purpose, and clearly say that you cannot use these for any purpose for spraying of pesticides. So I think the DGCA's view is also the same. But having said that, there are players in the industry who are offering that solution. But yeah, it will have to be I think you will need it to be specifically cleared by the DGCA. I mean, you will need specific clearance for anything, but pesticides is currently, I think the DGCA's view is also the same.
Okay. So I think that kind of complicates it because it needs finally the whole drone policy is there to facilitate and make sure that everybody are on a common framework to actually facilitate the use cases. And as you said, beyond visual line of sight not being a part of the car is effectively not making the drone industry progress, actually, because that's a great limitation. The purpose of drones is really for going beyond visual line of sight and automating and without the human presence and all of that. I do agree that it'll take its time, so maybe we'll just have to wait for the whole thing to play out over there. So there's a question by Sandeepan from Tropogo, and he is looking at drone insurance. The CAR 1.0 mandates that there is third-party liability insurance, which is a requirement for any drone operations. But this is not being actually followed, and I believe that Sandeepan he's into the business of trying to give insurance, but nobody is actually taking insurance. I remember the problem before was that nobody was offering insurance, even though we wanted to take insurance. So you want to talk about the insurance, the problem of the insurance? It's a chicken and egg story, as I understand it.
Chicken and egg story. I think, Sandeepan, you're not alone. There are a couple of other insurers that are and brokerage houses that are looking at this issue and attempting to launch products for drone operations. Um, the Why are we not seeing compliance? I think we are not seeing compliance at any level, right? I mean, see, the moment you fly a drone today, you are very likely not compliant to begin with. So if I'm anyway going to fly without compliance, should I further spend money on it and secure an insurance policy? I don't know. But I think the biggest market for insurance in the immediate or the times to the in the short run will be the commercial use case. So to the extent that there is and by commercial I mean largely industrial use case, for example, where say the government or a large corporate or an industry is giving an operator an order to fly drones in its premises or operate drones for its use. They will probably in their contract want to mandate insurance. Well, they would mandate compliance with the car, and in the contract itself, and they would mandate insurance as well, I think. And that would be, and I think because of which operators will definitely consider and be willing to spend money on insurance. So I think that's the opportunity. Your typical kind of wedding photographer or your typical, your regular small scale commercial activity is not going to be, I don't think that industry is going to take on to insurance immediately unless we see a stricter enforcement of the car itself.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that because it's a struggling industry, and I think more or less going to avoid everything that can be avoided. We are anyway breaking the law. You're just let's break one more law.
Sure.
So there's another question by Shashank Srinivasan. His question is: under what legal framework are various state agencies using drones for surveillance? So is there any kind of authority or a policy by which they're actually given the permissions to do what they're doing? So, and if they're not, then what is the kind of recourse that as a citizen we've seen during this COVID itself? We have seen a lot of police very much putting up videos on Twitter and other places of them chasing down people on playing carom under a tree, and I've seen a few more videos like of those kind. So what is the legal sanctity of it? We all understand it as an accepted, because it's an emergency situation, everything is like it's accepted over there, but uh, this is an abnormal situation which should not become the normal. So
Sure. So, under the card, there is actually there is no provision that requires a government agency or exempts a government agency from taking permission. I think, in fact, there is. Sorry, if you just give me a second, there is. Uh, Yeah, no, so they do talk about some kind of notification requirements, etc. But for the longest time, what we've seen in practice is that a lot of government agencies and the police, for instance, don't go through the DGCA when they are sanctioning any kind of operations. Uh, it is public sector undertakings, I've seen that they definitely do, but a lot of other government agencies and the police, etc., in particular, do not necessarily go through that route at all. For various reasons. One, for the longest time, there was actually ambiguity under the law itself on whether that is required. No separate guidelines have been issued by the DGC on this subject. And then eventually, also there was, because ultimately it is for the local police to enforce. So, they somehow probably feel that they are, any which way not subject to that requirement. But see, in the current times, at least what is happening is that the DGCA has not come out with any kind of clarifications for this for use of drones around during the lockdown, right? And that, I think, is inaction which cannot be uh, which uh, which I find very hard to justify. So obviously, what is happening is that instead of all these agencies, instead of going to the DGCA, which nobody knows how long it's going to take, there's no set procedure, there are no set guidelines. People are, so the governments and agencies are just going ahead and doing undertaking these operations, and while I think the very proper technically correct way of doing of carrying out any operations would be for even the government, the state governments, the police, etc., to take prior approval of the DGCA. I have sympathy with anybody who chooses not to, because honestly, I don't think you would really hear back in time. And I would have expected the DGCA to have. So it's not that the DGCA is not aware of this situation, right? One would have expected that they take action on their own, come out with some fast track approval process, or just give clarification as to for what purposes, what agencies can fly right now or not. Right? Nothing of that sort has been done.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because right now we don't even have manned flights, so there's actually an ample amount of time at hand
Absolutely,
to.
and it's far safer because there are hardly any manned flights. It's far safer as well. There are also not You also don't have the kind of traffic on the road. You don't have people on the road. So the chances of any kind of collateral damage are reduced significantly. Now is as good a time. I mean, it's a good time for us to really deploy drones effectively, and yeah, but
That's how it is. So Sandeepan has a follow-up question to the insurance problem, and he's basically asking a question which is saying that when you're non-compliant, that's fine for, civil work or commercial activity, but when you're taking up a government tender, then you will have to do a compliance for all of the requirements that are there as per the policy, and this same thing even is for other aspects, not just insurance, like including NPNT and all that. As of now, as you said, NPNT is the backbone of it is still not ready, but tenders still ask for NPNT compliance as part of their delivery, as part of the tender requirements. So how does one actually justify a tender and applying for a tender today?
Sure. I mean, I think the only way to do that is secure the tender and then apply for approvals. And to that extent, I think even if it's a government tender, obviously, then the relevant government agency also helps you out to a certain extent. But that's really the only way. You have to comply, and compliance will require you to get a special exemption or a permission from the DGCA. So I think the way to go about it is securing the tender, then applying alongside the awarding agency to the DGCA.
So that basically means that there's a opportunity for you, Sandeep. There are tenders that are coming around, and they need insurance, and you should be behind them for that. So
Yeah, but no, there are not too many tenders which. So one, there are not too many tenders because everybody realizes it's hard, it's difficult to comply. So even you're not seeing as much activity generally. But also when the tenders do come through, there is a fair bit of ultimately not in every case are you able to really put things into motion, because you may not secure the relevant approvals or whatnot. So it is quite difficult.
Which means that some things are pardoned. Non-compliance is pardoned in some way once you get the tender.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that you may get the tender and still not get the approval. So while you have the tender, you may not be able to fly irrespective.
Okay, but still activity goes on.
No, not necessary. I mean, typically for government, I would assume that if an activity is being tendered out, I'm assuming that whatever activity is being carried out is being done pursuant to approval from the DGCA. At least I will make that assumption. I don't know if that too is being contravened. There is definitely activity by various government agencies where they are choosing to ignore the DGCA approval requirement. That's a different thing. But the moment you put things out by way of a tender, usually you will see that there are, you know, uh, covenants in the tender saying that, well, the operator has to secure permission.
Okay.
And obviously, I mean, typically agencies are not. Yeah, so I do know. I mean, there are multiple scenarios where, say, the MHA is using or the PMO is using drones for various reasons, and they are clearly able to get, they're able to secure approvals on a fast track basis from the if required. So we are seeing both kinds of situations. But during the lockdown, at least, I think most of the activity is without approval, because nobody is wasting time reaching out to an office in Delhi trying to run, secure licenses.
Yeah, I think the whole process of getting the approval from DGCA itself is, mind-boggling. I mean, there was the floods last year, and when we were one among the people trying to help out during the floods using drones over there, and there was at some point in time there was a sudden backlash from the certain administrative people who basically said that this drone activity at this time will require us to get permissions from DGCA, and at that time it was a requirement that you actually submit it in writing, and the whole process would take a minimum of 7 days for the approval to come back to you to do that. And this is an emergency, we need you to deploy in the next 1.5 hours. That's the kind of situation that was there, and those are the times when they have actually chosen to uh, at least in my this thing, they've chosen to actually ignore the policy and actually go ahead with taking a certain amount of risk. So isn't it necessary that the policy actually takes care of such kind of a situation and actually allows people to do emergency activity?
It absolutely is, and I would say the policy actually allows for it also. The policy allows for exemptions. The
Okay.
thing that the DGCA is not really acting on. See, because what happens is that any kind of exemption requires you to basically means that you're applying your discretion, and which also means that you, the regulator, are also taking a certain risk on what you permit, right? So it is convenient for the regulator to just go by the rule book and not exercise its discretion and not expose itself to risk.
Mhm.
And they've chosen a convenient path through and through, which shouldn't be the case. Point is that the policy allows you to do it, but the regulator has not been acting.
So yeah, in this particular case, it was the person on the ground who chose to ignore and basically take the risk on himself. Should there have been inquiry or anything like that, it would be his neck on the line.
So I would say that in times like these, if there is action eventually, the odds of action are lower, and if there is action, the odds of penalty are lower, because any such uh, uh, action will also be meted out in the context of, nobody can be blind to the situation in which you are acting and the reason for which you are acting. You're not doing this to commit some kind of illegality.
Right.
And the emergent nature, the scope of the emergency, the need for quick action, etc., will all be taken into account, I guess. The problem is when in doing this kind of a this kind of a pro bono activity, if something were to go wrong, if there was an accident in that, kind of while you're doing this kind of an activity, then I think it could definitely could be very problematic for you. But for the most part, otherwise, I think that uh, I would be a little less worried about action and penalty in kind of emergency, in kinds of emergency, as opposed to the normal times.
I agree with you. I would just have preferred that it be actually worded out properly in the documents, for people to feel safe.
Yeah.
So, so I would agree with that. But should there be, is there a particular recourse available for people who are penalized on such kind of an case? Is there any recourse that is currently available?
Well, I mean, you can always make a representation to the DGCA. You can always go to the court challenging an order. There is actually very little precedence of the DGCA acting in any case, right? But but yeah, you have a recourse in the court.
So it's just like any other criminal activity that you'll have to, fight it out as well. Okay. So how do you see the future? I mean, what is the next stages of the policy? How is it going to actually pan out? What is the current considerations being taken for new policy?
So in the very short run, I think the it's all bad news. There's very little kind of movement that one expects on the policy front, largely because uh, you know the digital sky, the technological backbone itself, um, from all the conversations that at least I have had, it's we are several months away from any kind of pilotable deployment as well. And the COVID situation is only going to extend these timelines indefinitely. So I think there is little hope on that front. What will and should happen is that the DGCA starts to provide for exempted use cases, or a faster way to get licenses on an for exempted use cases, etc., right? So for emergencies, for government agencies. So for example, I mean, there is no reason why we can't have a fast track approval for government agencies, for PSUs to use within their industrial premises, for large vetted and cleared infrastructure projects, right? I mean, a lot of these kind of use cases could have been by now allowed. And even while we debate the larger use by the public at large, I understand the concerns around that. I mean, not that I'm fully happy with how much time we've taken on that, but I still understand that's going to take some time. But at least some of these low risk, high impact activities by the police, by the government, by the PSUs, by cleared industrial, all of that could have been permitted. And if not done so far, I think the DGCA should now consider doing it.
So at least they should actually open out a case by case approval, active for drone use, even if it is not in full compliance with a certain policy. It's a
So see,
case.
they will say that case by case is still open, and it is under the policy you can apply. You can get a case by case approval. The problem is that there's a intention action mismatch, right? Your policy allows for it, but you're not really acting on it. You're not really giving out approvals, and there is no process in place. There are no set of rules on the basis of which you will approve or deny. There is no timeline which is prescribed. So the absolute uncertainty of things has called the industry.
Okay. So that is interesting. And one more last question that I have with regard to DGCA being the policy and enforcement, unfortunately, being a law and order problem, would come under the state. How is the division actually happening? Who is responsible for what? Is there any understanding on that?
See, the local enforcement can only be done by the police, really. Right?
Okay.
What the DGCA can do is, of course, it can file complaints, or it can suspend your UIN, or the operator permit, etc. It can bar you from licensing in the future, etc. So that those are the kind of actions that the DGCA can take.
Okay. So because there was a recent case of Telangana MP who was arrested for flying a drone, and this is the first of its kind. And so DGCA in this case is not part of that enforcement. As I understand it, it's purely a local.
Arrests can only be made by the local police, obviously, and yeah.
Okay. So, but that's quite kind of interesting, because I think it's almost wrong to make a law which can't be enforced entirely. It's sometimes it's like that when you're having a situation wherein you don't have NPNT that is completely usable. It's not live yet, and you already have the regulation. We are in a kind of a limbo where you can't comply entirely in complete letter and spirit, but you're still having a regulation which you have to comply with.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but is there any way to get around this? I mean, what is the current? Is it still a case by case that is actually going on right now? How is it being dealt with right now?
You mean approvals or enforcement?
As of now, approvals during this time when the NPNT and Digital Sky are still not live, and the CAR 1.0 is already in effect. So, in between now, what's happening? How is it? How are the approvals being given?
Case by case, and most flights are still without approval.
So it's more or less illegal that is currently happening right
Technically,
now.
yes.
Okay, so that's interesting. And what are any closing comments that you have on the policy and how are we going to go about it? I really look forward to deliveries being one among the big things, and BVLO as being one among the uh, cornerstones for drone activity, because that's when the real drone power actually gets to show in the markets.
No, sure. I mean, I think we have disseminated, we've actually destroyed the local industry because of the time that we've taken to uh, get to where we are, and there's still very little in sight. So I think we really need to have a rethink of the way we are approaching this. There was a point in time when when Car One was issued. There was a lot of I think the problem was that we actually wanted to make an incredible set of regulations which are unprecedented and something that the world will follow. That was really the ambition of the then of the ministry at that point in time, and I think it was just over ambitious. We went we lost kind of sight of the ground reality a little bit. So it was I think what we need to do now is to scale down our ambition. Instead of chasing digital sky, of course, we can carry on that front, but what we need to do is immediately allow for certain low risk activities and certain activities that can, so case by case is one way to do it. If we want to do case by case, then have a clear set of process and rules for it, and or otherwise we exempt larger categories of drone operations, right? As I said, industrial use or police use, etc. And subject to, of course, again, a clear set of guidelines and rules, but we need to start permitting certain use cases. And unless we do that, we will always remain scared of, the kind of the because how do we understand the real risk to drone operations unless and until we allow some operations, right? I mean, the way it is as much a learning for the industry as it is for the regulator as well. So you have to allow certain limited use cases, and then see how, the evaluate over a period of time the real risk that activity imposes on the society, and use that understanding to then evolve your regulations. So I think we really need to start get things into motion on that front.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I really look forward to the regulation changing. But I'm very much concerned when you saying that we need to lower our ambition. I really don't know whether we can lower our ambition means roll back a little bit on what the policy actually asks for.
No, I'm not. I don't mean by lowering. I don't mean rolling back the policy.
Not
What I
rolling
mean,
back at least parts of it,
no,
So
that's not what I'm saying. I'm
okay,
saying that that you don't have to achieve. So, okay, Digital Sky is an ambitious program, right?
Right.
If we wait for, if we say that we are going to allow every single drone operation in the country, only when the Digital Sky is finally implemented and tested and then implemented at scale, then I'm going to have 3 years of no activity in this country. I'm saying that lower down that ambition, allow some activity gradually. While I mean, Digital Sky is a good idea, be at it, but don't lose sight of the reality. We desperately need some level of drone activity in the country. Otherwise, your local industry is also going to be many years behind the global industry.
Yeah. On that note, I think we've had a quite an interesting session. So I I mean I don't know. I hope to see a better future for the drones, and I think it's bright, but we'll have to deal with these hurdles right now in the short term. And in that, I'd like to thank you, Anirudh, for this time spent.
Thank you so
And
much.
I think our viewers have got to understand a lot more about the policy and why we've got here and how what we can hope look forward to. So once again, I'd like to thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Really
Thank
enjoyed it.
you. Pleasure. So yeah, thanks guys. Thanks for viewing.